Hey guys, this is Courtney from Willis Bloom, and today we have a very important and special topic about planets in combustion. So, if you are relatively new to astrology, or even if you're not, you might not know this. So, essentially, what combustion means is that a planet is too close to the sun that it loses visibility. And actually, if you look up at the sky, if you have a telescope, not a super major telescope even, you can see with your naked eye all of the visible planets, which I'm going to list now. So moon, which is actually a luminary, but regardless, obviously you can see the moon, and you can see Mercury, you can see Mars, you can see Venus, Jupiter, Saturn. Am I forgetting any of them? I think that's it. And so essentially what happens is when one of those planets are next to the sun in the sky, when you look up, you can't see it anymore because the sun is so bright. Its rays shine so bright. And this can have a blinding effect on that planet within your natal chart as well. So every planet has its own signification. So for example, Venus is a relationship planet. And it also has a secondary signification of whatever house or houses it rules in your natal chart. So Venus is the planet that rules over the sign of Taurus and Libra. So let's say you're an Aries rising, you have Taurus on the second house and Libra on the seventh house. So now Venus is the planet in charge of your second and seventh house, which is money and relationships. So the reason I know I'm moving really quickly. So if you don't have these basic foundations, this video might be a little bit quick for you, but you can go back and maybe watch some of my other previous ones. But essentially what this means is that now that Venus is right next to the sun and is blinded by the sun, she becomes blinded in those areas of your life within your chart. So because her natural signification has to do with relationships, she's blinded by relationships. But she's also the ruler of your second and seventh house. So she's also blinded to the topics of money and, again, relationships. So that means that that area of your life is going to look a little bit different than if she were not in the light of the sun. So imagine if you're trying to walk around and take your dog for a walk, and your dog can't see. And this is very relatable to me because my dog is blind. And what happens is the dog is going to bump into everything. She's not going to be aware of what's around her and what's happening. And that's sort of how this planet will be in your life. You may lack awareness around something to do with the houses that planet rules. So for Venus, if it's ruling your second and seventh house, you are going to have blind spots around these areas. And this could look like you not knowing where your money is going every month. You're spending and you're trying to budget, but it somehow just slips through your fingers and you lack awareness. Or it could look like a partner cheating on you, or something coming out of the blue, out of nowhere, or dating somebody that they turn out to be different than what you expected. So these are just some examples that are negative, and it doesn't always have to be negative because there are definitely benefits from having a planet combust the sun, but there are typically hardships associated with it as well. And the reason being is because the planet is not only blinded by the sun, but it's also burned by it. You know, you don't want to walk that closely to the sun or be outside for a super long time on a really hot day. There are kind of negative consequences, although you may get tan, which is nice, and you may kind of feel like the energy from the sun. There are also negative effects of being burnt. And so we're going to kind of talk about this today, and we're going to talk about each specific planet and how that might relate to your life and your chart. But just remember, this is going to affect your birth chart. It's going to affect you in relation to your birth chart. So whatever houses that planet rules is going to be affected by the planet being next to the sun or combust the sun. Okay, so we're going to get into some examples, and I will pull up some charts and everything for you guys to look at. But I did want to just kind of give you the rundown of everything first, and then maybe I'll get into some specifics in a second here. So what's interesting about a planet that's combust, in the Vedic tradition, they considered that a planet combust is both weakened and pronounced. So a planet that is next to the sun, which is associated with our identity, our career, our life path, will actually inform our identity. So whatever that planet usually means will become part of who we are in a very significant way. So for example, if I have, like I said, Venus on the sun, maybe I become somebody who has relationships as a very core part of my life. That doesn't mean that I'm in a lot of relationships, but it does represent an important part of my life. Or what can happen as a result is that your career, the sun, your identity, your career, the more masculine part of yourself can then over dominate your relationships and make that less significant. But it's actually still significant, even though you maybe don't put energy into it. It's still significant because it may be a part of your life that is very noticeable or somehow important, even though it's not either healthy or there's not energy put there, or it's like underdeveloped in some way. That doesn't mean it's less important. I hope that's making sense. And so it becomes part of your identity, but it can also sometimes become exaggerated, and we can sometimes also lack awareness about how we represent that planet. So those are all possibilities. And I also want to give the possibility that that planet near your sun can relate to you having a career in a related field around that planet. So like I mentioned, Venus is about relationships. You could be a relationship therapist, or Venus is also related to like gardening, and because it is a ruler of Taurus, it's related to taking care of the earth, style, aesthetic. So maybe you have a career associated with one of those things. So that's another potential. There's a lot to say. There's I feel like I'm going to forget a lot of stuff. But just keep in mind that it becomes part of your identity. It becomes exaggerated. It can become also underdeveloped as well. So there's something unstable about this planet in your life, because it becomes either too much or too little, or not fully understood, not fully seen in its entire capacity. And the houses associated with it as well have that effect. So keep that in mind. So what typically happens when a planet is combust your sun is you will have a different kind of superpower. And it's because the planet doesn't function as well in the earthly realm, but its powers will still function in a different way. So again, it's part of your identity. So if you have Venus on the sun, maybe there is something like tantalizing about you, or something that is attractive about you or magnetic about you, but you may struggle with relationships. So it's like you may be very liked, but then you also may be a loner, and you also kind of take yourself out of the equation, or you over-identify with relationships, like I said, because it can be exaggerated. So it becomes part of your identity in that you are magnetic and attractive to people, because that's what Venus does. But then at the same time, so that's your superpower, but then at the same time in the actual real world, that might be an area that's difficult for you. And so that's where those superpowers don't always land into the material world. There can also be something really like unseen or hidden about these planets in your life. You might be somebody that, especially in those areas of your life, you want to operate behind the scenes. You don't want people knowing or talking about this area of your life, especially which houses it rules. Or you may just be like more of a loner in that specific area of your life. There's a sense of privacy, or not wanting to share everything, or being very inward about that experience in your life. And that's just kind of what happens. So it's going to be not considered combustion. Let's talk about what combustion is. I've already mentioned the planet being right next to the sun, but what is considered right next to the sun? Well, we're typically looking at like 7 to 8, maybe 8.5 degrees away from the sun. So let's say I have my sun at 5 degrees of Scorpio. If my Mars is at 10 degrees of Scorpio, or even a little bit more, then my Mars is combust. And it is not considered combust if it is very, 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 very close to the sun within 17 minutes. So let's say you have your sun at 8 degrees of Scorpio and your Mars at 8 degrees of Scorpio. Now your Mars is not combust, it's cazimi, which means that it's in the heart of the sun. And so this will have a different effect because it tends to make it more favorable. There is more of a possibility of redemption. Although I personally believe that you will still experience the combustion and some of the things that we'll talk about in a minute. You may have more favorable outcomes as a result of having them so close. And I believe Elizabeth Taylor is a good example of this. So I'll have to use her chart as an example. So cazimi is when it's super, super close. And this is considered favorable because the sun is the king of the zodiac. And so when you're sitting right up next to the sun, it's almost like he's whispering in your ear and giving you special favors or instructions that's going to help you in your life. Regardless, every planet is meeting up with the sun in a cycle to get its next instructions about what to do on its next cycle. So whenever it's moving through a cycle, it has its mission. It knows what it wants. It knows what it's going after, what it's trying to learn or produce. And it's on its merrily way, and then it comes back to the sun, and it is like the hero's journey. It's exhausted, it's tired, it's lived out its mission as best as it could, and now it's kind of come as its weak, tired version of itself at the very, very end of a long hike, and it's asking for its next instructions from the sun. And so it is that kind of weakness in which it inhabits in a sense, but there is still the king giving it its orders. So there is still kind of it's still indicating that it's somehow a superpower because it's connected with the king or your personality or your identity. So there's still some kind of like superpower there, although the planet is weakened and tired and everything of that nature. So I hope that this is making sense so far. If you have questions, please leave them in the comment box and I can definitely answer those for you. So only the visible planets can be combust because the idea of combustion is that they are suddenly invisible in the sky. And so planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, all these outer planets that are not visible from the naked eye are never going to be combust because that's just like doesn't fit within the paradigm of what I'm even talking about. So the main thing around combustion is, again, being quite like blurred or unseen, under the radar, and oftentimes unknown to the individual who has that combustion. So there's a lack often of self-awareness around some area surrounding that planet. And so that is super important to consider. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about what this might look like for each of the planets. So if the moon is combust the sun, this is considered a new moon. And actually, I just want to back up for 1 second, because as I mentioned, the hero's journey, each planet is going around its cycle and then coming back to the sun, tired and exhausted. What's happening here in this darkness of the sun, like where it's blinded by the sun, so now it can't see. So there's a sense of darkness there that it's invisible, it cannot see. There is an impregnation happening. Not only is a king whispering the next duties, but it's impregnating the idea, the desire, the joy, whatever it needs to move on its mission. And so it's like planting a seed for the new beginning. And so I think that there's kind of like a new moon energy for all of the planets that become combust the sun. But obviously a new moon, or the moon being next to the sun, is going to be even more so that energy. So the moon is the part of ourselves that is representing our inner nature, our personal needs, and also has a lot to do with our mother or our childhood. And whatever house is Cancer in your chart, whatever house cusp has Cancer on it, that is also ruled by the moon and will be affected by the moon combust the sun. And so this can often have to do with being a little bit detached or unaware of one's childhood, one's mothering ability, or the mother itself. And sometimes maybe also where you put your emotional needs to the side to focus on your career, or you put your mothering needs to the side to focus on your duty. This can often be the case, as well as maybe there being more inner alignment with these two areas of your life, which is the gift here. So on one hand, this is your duty, but you also want that duty in some capacity. So there may be a sacrifice of more of your internal world for your external duty, but also there's part of you that enjoys that or wants that sacrifice to happen. And so it doesn't feel as difficult as some of the other planets combust the sun. And so basically an example of this would be somebody who goes out into the world and lives out their career and maybe doesn't necessarily always stay home to take care of the children in certain ways. And so they may be more of a detached mother, or not nurturing and mothering themselves in maybe the same way that they would if they didn't have their moon next to the sun. So that's one example. If we have Mercury, which is representative of our thinking or our processing of information, if this is combust the sun, which is very, very common, very common, and that's because Mercury is always within a sign and a half, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or 2 signs of the sun. So they're always traveling really close together. Sometimes Mercury goes faster. Regardless, they're really close together. They're like tied at the ankles, kind of pulling each other back and forth in some ways. They're not doing that, actually. First, forget that I said that. That's a bad analogy. But regardless, they are tied together in some way. So Mercury will stay very close to the sun, and it's often combust because of how close it is. And so what happens is that these individuals, because Mercury is usually associated with intelligence, these individuals may overly identify with their intelligence because the sun is our identity and Mercury is our thinking, our processing, our intelligence. And so this can exaggerate or underdevelop this area of their life. So they might feel like they're not intelligent enough, or they might feel like they are extremely intelligent and overly identify with it. They might talk too much, or they might talk too little. And they might not have full awareness of how much information they are sharing, which is actually very common and makes a lot of sense why this is a common aspect. I've also seen within childhood, that since the sun is representative of the father or of a dominant parental figure, so sometimes the mother has more of that energy than the father. So it's not really gender-based, it's more energetic. So the dominant parental figure, often the father, will not necessarily listen to the child. The child will say something and it's like it goes in one ear or out the other, or maybe they get talked over, or maybe they tell the child that you look pretty with your mouth shut, or something along those lines, where they are invalidating the communicative experience of the child. And this then results in there being a lack of awareness around this area of their life, or a wounding around this area of their life. And so again, it's like maybe there is a little bit more difficulty with this element of communicating and understanding one another. And any area of life, any house that is ruled by Gemini or Virgo will also have these issues surrounding it. You may lack awareness and full control over these 2 areas of your life. And so sometimes it can also be it can also be hard for these individuals if they are tying their identity to their intelligence or to their ability to communicate or get something across. And yeah, I mean, obviously that's inherently challenging, as you can see why, because your intelligence is always going to be compared to someone else's, right? Like, you're going to have to be the more intelligent one and the one that can express better. And that's like a never-ending battle. Mercury is also a planet associated with adaptation. So this will really depend on the context of the entire chart, but there may be areas of your life where you're less adaptable because of this combustion. But again, this will really largely depend on your chart. If you're a Gemini and you have a lot of mutable signs and, you know, placements of planets in your chart, it probably won't apply to you as much. So context is key here, guys. If you ever want a reading from me for that context and to kind of take everything into account, there's always like different weights to everything that really matters. But if you are interested in that, definitely check me out using the link in the description box down below. Okay, very meaningful to me, and because I see this all the time in my clients and even personal relationships, is Venus combust the sun. So Venus is our planet of affection. It's how we feel like we are receiving kind of that love that we're looking for. Not just like emotional love like the moon is, where I will care for you, make sure you're safe, but the love of like, you're so beautiful, like let me give you a hug, let me show how much you mean to me through my affection in some capacity. So with Venus combust the sun, there's usually a lack of affection in childhood. This is oftentimes like the father figure being a little bit colder or more analytical. This is usually coming from people who are like uncomfortable saying I love you or giving hugs. They may just have this kind of more distant experience, and this will range drastically for people, but for some people it might feel like I never got love from my father, he was absent or he wasn't there emotionally. Or it could be I knew he loved me, but he was very practical and he kind of never said anything about it. I just kind of knew. And this doesn't have to be just the father. This can be a childhood experience with any of the parents. But there is just kind of this general feeling of I didn't really get to soak up all the good stuff in my childhood. I felt like I was yearning as a soul for more than my parents had the capacity to give me, or one of my parents. And so it can feel like there is a lifelong search or yearning that maybe is unconscious to you for that love, for that affection. And so these people can become very relationship oriented, or they can do the opposite and sacrifice their relationships for their career. And we see this in Venus Williams, who has Venus combust the sun. And she has said like, that's not important to her in her life right now. So she's going all in on her career. Her relationships are taking a complete back seat, and she has sacrificed that area for this area of her life. And sometimes that can switch as well. So this will really like vary depending on who you are and what stage of life you're in. And it can also make you a more likable and attractive person. Often Venus is a planet of beauty. So being on the sun, which has a lot to do with kind of, not a lot to do, but it has to do with our appearance in some ways. The ascendant has a lot to do with that too. But having Venus on the sun can make you more attractive. That's not, again, always going to be like the case, but you will generally become attractive for some reason. If it's not physical, then there is something about you that's energetic, that's emotional, that people vibe with, that people want to be around. That's usually going to be the case of some sort. And so you do have this kind of superpower where people are drawn to you. But then you may also have, first of all, a lack of awareness around that, or you might be so like hungry for this affection that you often lack during childhood that you will again seek out relationships, and sometimes these can be unhealthy. So you're looking for like something to love on and to love you back. But that means that sometimes you might attract, with this sense of hunger, people who are maybe not always like in your best interest, people who take advantage, or people who you can't fully trust. And this is not always going to be the case. This is really dependent on your chart. But sometimes I will see with Venus combust the sun that people will date partners where they don't fully see their flaws. They don't see that they are possibly a cheater, or that they, like there's some quality about them that's not a likable quality, and they will pursue that person and be in love with that person, but other people around them will see this, except them. And so this is not always the case, but these are all possible manifestations that I have personally witnessed. And also, any houses ruled by Taurus and Libra will have a similar effect. There may be blind spots in those areas of your life as well. And so sometimes Venus on the sun may over prioritize relationships and really stay in unhealthy dynamics longer than they should, and not listen to other people around them saying like, hey, this person's not good for you, da da da. Or they may sacrifice their relationships for their career and be like, I don't need affection. I am getting my sustenance from my career, from what I go after, from what I create in my life. Sometimes this can also create somebody who's very socially over or underactive. So I'm going to be a loner, or I'm going to be having a million friends. That's not, again, that doesn't have to necessarily be the case, but there can be, I have seen oftentimes like someone who appears social and who's likable and who people like them, but there's something very private about them that they don't share with others. Or they may have like few intimate close friends that they're really willing to share themselves. That's my personal experience with this. Venus is also a very creative planet. So not only does it bring beauty into you physically, but also brings beauty into your life. So these are often people who are good at art, at music, who have interest in painting or planting, like anything along those lines where you're creating beauty in life. You can usually be good at that. And there can be this underlying feeling that you are unworthy or unlovable in some way. And again, this is kind of going back to childhood, where you're not getting necessarily all the affection you craved as a soul during that time of your life. And so there can be this feeling, this hunger for it, and a belief system that can be unconsciously created that I am not lovable, I'm not worthy. And so there's the hunger and that kind of work together. Another example of somebody who's very successful who has this is Oprah Winfrey. And we all know Oprah is a super successful woman, but we never really hear her talk about her relationship. So extremely private. I'm not even sure if she's with someone, but I think she is. So regardless, her career has really taken the center focus of her life. And so you may see that oftentimes with like famous people, because the relationships often become secondhand to their wild, unruly, but massive careers. And yeah, so again, when we look at planets with combust sun, they're going to be highly subjective. So that person has a very subjective experience and has trouble like looking from the outside in about what that experience is like. So they may not see this all about themselves and their relationships. If you tried to address this with them, they might not resonate with it entirely. Mars combust sun. I also have a very intimate experience with this with loved ones. So this is interesting. These energies combine easily, but can also be a little bit challenging as well, because they're both fiery planets. Mars is super fiery, so is the sun, obviously. And so what happens when you have fire on fire, it just amplifies this within yourself. So this also relates to other planets combust the sun, but especially with Mars combust the sun, because Mars is a malefic or challenging planet. You can see health conditions associated with this planet. And so Mars is irritation, inflammation, a lot of heat in the body, a lot of heat in the body. If you have Venus combust the sun, there are going to be, I forget what Venus rules, but there may be whatever, like sexual organs. So basically ovaries, eyes, generative system, water and phlegm, kidneys, flesh, skin. All those things are Venus. So Venus combust the sun. You could possibly have some health things going on with that you're not fully aware of. I don't like talking about health with astrology because that's not my forte. Medical astrology is a whole branch that I have not fully studied. So moving on, you may have inflammation with this, with Mars combust the sun. I know somebody who has this in the 6th house, and he has like a very irritated stomach. His stomach is never fully settled, and the 6th house has to do with our intestines and our stomach oftentimes, like Virgo. And so, yes, it's inflamed. So this can be helpful in kind of understanding, like, why is this happening? And maybe what can I do in my life, my lifestyle choices, to then bring the heat down. So this can manifest on a physical or an emotional level, and often both, because emotionally you can be maybe more temperamental. You can be fiery. You can become a little bit more aggressive. very enthusiastic, maybe rough, passionate, all the kind of Mars energy. Mars is our animalistic side. So this becomes part of your identity. You become like able to express that more kind of willful side of yourself. What's interesting though is that Mars is also being blinded by the sun, and the sun being our father can associate with having some kind of strong dominant parental figure in your childhood that didn't allow you to fully express your will. So for example, let's say as a little kid, you wanted to do this one thing, or you wanted to express anger, or you wanted to be wild and messy, or whatever it was. That parent was like, no, you can't do that. No, you can't express your wild, messy side. No, you can't express anger. No, you can't do that thing. No, 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 no. And what becomes internalized is my will is bad, or my will is not allowed. And it can create this negative relationship with being assertive and taking action. And what it does is it becomes exaggerated and underdeveloped or unhealthy at the same time. So on one hand, you might really want to assert yourself and really don't take well to being controlled because you're very fiery. You had the experience in childhood. You're like, F that, I'm not going to deal with that. And on the other hand, you might at times not be assertive enough. You might not make decisions quickly enough because Mars is our ability to take action, to move forward. You might hold yourself back and be uncertain because Mars is also related to our confidence. It's the masculine, it's the willpower, it's the ambition, assertiveness, even sexuality. All of those things can have some kind of like stifling or delay around them. And any houses ruled by Aries or traditionally Scorpio may have similar effects to this as well. And so one of the really good things about this is to use this as a physical outlet because Mars is a very physical planet. So while you may kind of struggle with making decisions or moving things forward, or even sometimes expressing anger in a healthy way, maybe it's too much, too little, if you're feeling all those experiences, channeling it into a sport or a risky activity can be very helpful. So I see people with this placement, they are in law enforcement, they are going to be the race car drivers or the athletes. They are in some type of risky kind of physical outlet, or maybe one where they're protecting people because, again, sun is our career. So many of them will be interested in careers like that, and they can then channel the energy into that direction. Like, I'm going to go into law enforcement and protect people, and this way it might not manifest as me struggling with certain things in my life. And so that's one area in which they would benefit. Also, there is a desire to just express aggression in general. So things that make you go really fast, like skiing, skateboarding, snowboarding, driving, all those things can feel like stimulating, exciting, and aggressive a little bit, and a little bit scary. It's like getting your adrenaline going. This is what this placement does. It has a high intensity of adrenaline in a kind of constant way, and that's why there's so much heat in the body. Imagine if you had constant adrenaline. You're like constantly ready to go, constantly ready to fight. Like, there's part of you that is just overstimulated and maybe very anxious as a result of this, which is totally normal if you have this placement and you're like super high anxiety. You need to channel this into physical outlets. You have to get a certain amount of exercise every day, take a certain amount of risk in your life to get this energy out of you, because it's just building and within you. And you may have an unhealthy relationship with this energy, with your sex drive, with your passion, with your ambition, but also with your anger. You may feel like it's stifled. You may feel like it's over the top. And so it's about kind of, again, finding a way to you work with this energy without it kind of controlling you is going to be really important. You may also go through depressive episodes if you're going through difficult transits to these planets, because as I mentioned, Mars is our confidence. And so and it's like our energy and our fuel and all of those things to move us forward. So if you, for example, are going through a Saturn transit to these planets, it can feel like you are really stopped in your tracks and like you are not confident in your decisions, and you just emotionally are not moving forward. So it can kind of be difficult. And so, yes, it's it's one of the more difficult aspects to have, essentially. Also, there can be a very strong leadership ability here as well. So the thing about Mars is that there's something a little bit rebellious. It has kind of Uranus energy where it wants to do what it wants to do. And so having Mars with the sun can indicate that there is part of you that doesn't take well to being controlled or defined or put in a box or told what to do. And so coming into some kind of leadership position, having a little bit more control over your life, even working in business, for example, working for yourself, can be really beneficial for Mars combust the sun. So for these people, I'm just going to wrap up with that. You really want to be aware of your relationships because Mars is a planet that tends to divide people, push people away. And so whatever area where Mars rules, so whatever house has Aries and Scorpio can be affected by this, but anywhere in your life really. You may find that you can push people away or you can get angry or uncontrolled, have so much energy that it pushes others. And so it's really, I think, gaining awareness, since you may have a lot of unconscious stuff happening here, how your fieriness impacts others is going to be important. All right. I can go on and on. I'm just going to move on, though. Jupiter combusts the sun is not necessarily something that I ever see as a bad thing or very difficult. Jupiter is such a good planet that it tends to give us a lot of blessings when it's with the sun. It has actually a very similar energy to the sun in its kingliness. And so I think that they're kind of more like brothers and friends rather than the sun outshining and competing and over dominating Jupiter. Generally, what I see from this is that people are extremely optimistic and maybe like kind of overly optimistic. So they're like, oh, everything is possible. And this can be really beneficial though. Like generally being optimistic is not going to hurt you. And so I see these people actually having a lot of luck in their career, being strong leaders, and really their exuberance and their optimism is truly helping them. And what I see often also is that they will be the people who will come to you, and I see this also with Jupiter and Uranus aspects as well. They're the people who want to like lift you up, to get you the next job, to promote you, to help you in your life. So they just tend to be like very energized and happy and optimistic and want to help people, and they tend to benefit from this as well. So there's not a whole lot of negative stuff that I've seen. If you guys have had any negative experiences with Jupiter combust the sun, let me know in the description box down below. All right, and then last but not least, we have Saturn combust the sun. Oh my gosh, I actually know quite a few people in my close, friend, family circle that have this. And it is an interesting one because the sun and Saturn can actually both represent the father in the chart or this kind of dominant parent figure. Saturn is the rule maker, and it tends to set up boundaries that we have to live within. And when this is on the sun, this can actually be a little bit challenging. Normally, we think of the sun taking over and blinding that planet. However, Saturn is a malefic planet, so it's also negatively impacting the sun. All of these planets are pouring into our identity, as I mentioned. With Mars, you're an athlete. With Venus, you're attractive or artistic. With Saturn, you're very hardworking. It's pouring into your identity, this work ethic. Too much so, usually. I see people with Saturn on the sun, it's like their lives have been fully dedicated to work, even if they don't want that to be true. I often see that that's part of their karma, is that they have to work very hard, even if that's not really what they want. And it's actually often a very important part of their identity is I am this hard worker. And, I don't know. It's like there can be this interesting / unhealthy relationship with it. However, sometimes I've also seen Saturn on the sun where people are not hardworking at all, and they can be given leadership positions because Sun Saturn makes one this kind of teacher, this wise authority figure. People look up to them. They see that they have something to offer. And Saturn on the sun usually indicates someone very hardworking who does step up to the plate and takes on that responsibility, gets a promotion, keeps working their way up, does well. maybe takes on too much of a burden for others. But sometimes it goes the opposite direction, where they offload work onto others, where they show up late, where they're not consistent, and yet like they have this job and they have this promotion and people still trust them in that role. And sometimes they, like, others don't see that they're actually not a good worker. So I have seen kind of both come up in life. And so there can be a laziness around this or an overproductivity around this. Saturn is also an area of insecurity. And so we will typically find that there is something about our childhood where it cultivated coldness. And that coldness that comes from Saturn, where it could have a huge range depending on the rest of our chart. It could mean that your mom or your dad straight up told you that you weren't good enough. Or they could have just not been emotionally available for you. They could have been distant. You could have had a parent pass away from a young age. They could have literally not been in the home, like one single parent family. There's usually this kind of dynamic, often with the father, but could be the mother as well, where there's a very strained relationship in some capacity. Either that's emotional or physical or whatever. And that strained relationship, which again is in varying degrees for people. So I've seen it very light, where they love their family, they have a good relationship with their family, but the father was working really hard and he was away a lot and he wasn't like very emotionally soft or affectionate, or there's a coldness, a seriousness that is pervasive within the home. And this could be because maybe in your home there was a lack, and so there was like, oh, we have to survive, we have to work really hard to survive, and then that's what gets embedded into you, and that becomes the pervasive or dominant feeling, this coldness that's associated with just needing to survive versus thriving, being in a great, happy, healthy home. But yes, I have seen like people have really amazing relationships with their family still with this placement, and the father was just really always working. But still, there's usually some kind of like disconnect emotionally there because of Saturn's ability to restrict. And so what happens is then we can develop a lot of anxiety because we need kind of like this soft place to land and be a kid and have our parents there and get affection, get love, get our needs met. And they maybe grew up in a household where it's very work oriented. They maybe just were very open to that, perceptive of that, and they took that on. There was a seriousness, like being kind of an adult from a young age. That can sometimes happen, taking a lot of responsibilities. And what does all this do? It leads to anxiety because you're not just like this free-flowing kid who can just do what it wants. Like, you are really taking on burdens of the world from a young age, or even if it's not from a young age, you're taking on excessive burdens as you get older. And so there is this extreme work ethic or underwork ethic and the anxiety there as well. And so sometimes I do see people, depending on the rest of their chart, they may escape that anxiety in some ways. Again, this will depend on their chart. But they may want to escape through TV or through more work or through, anything. You use your imagination. And so this anxiety, this coldness or hard work ethic, growing up too fast, all those things also lead one to put way too much pressure on themselves when they have Saturn on the sun. This is somebody who feels like they're not doing good enough. There's a perfectionistic tendency. But again, because it's combust, they might not actually see this in themselves. And whatever houses are ruled by Aquarius, which is Saturn is a traditional ruler of Aquarius, or Capricorn, may have similar energies where they're lacking awareness or they're overworking and don't even know that they're overworking in this area of their life. Exactly. So they basically can feel that they're never doing good enough. They're never like fully where they want to be. They feel like they're behind, or they can compare themselves to others, and it can be hard, and it might be this very internal thing you might never know on the surface. And sometimes, again, they might not even be fully aware of how much they're doing that to themselves and how good they actually are because of this process being so internal. So I guess that's what I want to say. I feel like there's maybe the last thing I'll add with that is that there can sometimes feel like there's a delay in life. Like I'm delayed in getting my career where I want. I'm delayed in getting this or that, the other. That's not always going to be the case. I've seen people reach success very young with this, but there can be this feeling again of like, I'm not where I want to be in this area of my life yet. So wherever Saturn is or whatever house it rules can have this feeling to it in general. And then with the sun mixed in, maybe there's a reason it's delayed because of your career or something of that nature. The very, very last thing I'll mention is Saturn on the sun can also influence your health in a difficult way as well, because the sun has to do with, I believe it has to do with our heart. If it's like Leo energy. So anyway, the Saturn is a malefic and can negatively influence the sun. So there can be some health things that come up with that, with bones or your heart. I'm not going to get super into that because, again, I don't like talking about it, but there's that if you want to do more research. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and get into some chart examples. Okay, so my first chart here is one I was already mentioning, which is Venus Williams. And she has her Venus combust the sun within 4 degrees. They're both in the sign of Gemini. The sun is blinding Venus. So basically, as I mentioned before, her relationships can have some unknown qualities to them. So they become basically areas which are kind of inaccessible or unconscious to her. And this, as I mentioned before, can relate to in childhood not really getting the affection that you want from a parental figure. And whatever areas of life associated with Venus can also have some similar distortions and can experience the sacrificing to her career like the sun does. So Venus is the ruler of her first house and of her 8th house. So we know that she might sacrifice her relationships for her career, but she might also sacrifice or have blind spots in the area of 1st or 8th house matters. So, for example, the 1st house is associated with the self. So she may have some blind spots about herself. There may be ways in which she doesn't recognize her own decision making, her own patterns, and Pluto in the 1st house as well is also very unconscious planet. So there's an indication here that there could also be aspects of her personality that might be a little bit controlling in relationships that she maybe isn't aware of. That's a potential. I don't know her, so I can't say for sure. It also rules the 8th house. Lastly, the 1st house is, and the ascendant has also to do with our health and our body. So there could be elements of her physical health that she becomes aware of later in life that was unknown to her. The 8th house tends to be vulnerability and shared resources and investments. So there may be areas, this may be an area of her life in which she has some lack of awareness. So let's say she got into a relationship with somebody and they got divorced. Or before they got divorced, she might be like, we're never going to get divorced. Everything's going to be great forever. And then with the 8th house, they may get a divorce and she may lose a bunch of money, especially with Chiron here, and be unsuspecting of that because of Venus ruling this area of her chart, being blinded by the sun. Another example of this is her insecurities being a really driving factor for her relationships not working out or for her not being in a relationship at all. And I say that especially because Chiron is a planet or asteroid where we find our fears and insecurities along with Saturn. And so the fact that it's in the 8th house and Venus is also ruling this house can be an indicator that maybe within her relationships, her insecurities play a much bigger role. Her fear of letting go of control or being manipulated in these power dynamics, not really trusting and being willing to open up to people. These things can play a much bigger role in her decision making to sacrifice her relationships to her career than she is owning up to or aware of. So that's just one example. Let's take a look at another. All right, our next example is Ryan Reynolds. So he has his sun at 0 degrees of Scorpio and moon at 3 degrees of Scorpio. So the moon is combust the sun in the 2nd house. So in this case, we can see, just like I was talking about earlier, where there can be a sacrifice towards a career from what the moon represents. So we can see this also with Queen Victoria, who, even though she had a ton of children, was very much the ruler of the monarchy. And so we can see this here with Ryan Reynolds, where I know that he is a dad, but there may actually be in some ways a prioritization or sacrifice of his dad roles that he experiences for his career. And he might feel this, or it might just be this unconscious pattern. And because this is in the second house as well, there is a heavy emphasis or desire focus on material stability and achievement. And so he is going to be very driven to achieve his goals. The moon, as I mentioned, is our needs and our security, and it can also be related to our mind as well, like what we are driven towards through our mind to meet those needs. And so our emotional responses, for example, is a good example, is an example of this, because we emotionally react to what we think. Mercury is also the mind, but in a more like logical way, where the moon is a subjective mind. So the moon being combust the sun here is also indicating that it's almost like he can override how he feels, or prioritize his career above how he's feeling, and that becomes his mind, like where his mind is at. So it makes his goals fortified or even more important, which is again why you might sacrifice some of these moon tendencies. The moon is also the ruler of the 11th house. So there may be ways in which he is unaware of friendships, community, and belonging. He may have unconscious patterns that play out in this area of his life, because the moon is the ruler of this area of his chart, and it's blinded by the sun. So he may be unaware of some areas of friendships where he shows up as weak, or where he attracts negative people. This is even more so because his Saturn is here. So Saturn is a planet that delays and creates hardships and more work. And wherever we have Saturn in our chart, we're going to have a little bit of insecurity or strife. And so on top of this, so his moon is already meaning that he's not fully understanding his relationships or his sense of belonging. This is an area that can be confusing for him, or that he's completely unconscious of, or that his career has sacrificed his ability to have friends. It could very simply be that because of his career, he really has had trouble making true friends. He has very few friends. Maybe he's very loyal to them, but they were hard won with Saturn in this house. Maybe he has a hard time trusting these random people. That makes a lot of sense as a celebrity. And so we can specifically see this in his chart, that his friendships, his community, his way of feeling really like he has a sense of belonging really comes second to his career and his financial status and his goal as a person. So his goals are going to be his primary focus, and his friendships last, and then maybe his family will be up there, but maybe he's somebody who would say, well, I need to provide for my family. So that still becomes the primary focus, because as a result of my career and my goals, it's ultimately going to create stability for my family. And so it's like the moon and the sun are on the same page, even though it's kind of sacrificing that more interior world where it's like I'm maybe not as home as much as I'd like to, or maybe I'm not as like sensitive and focused on my emotions as normally the moon would be. But it's still, the moon wants the same thing that the sun wants. So they're on the same page, they're achieving the same goals. And so it's, again, fortifying this area of his life. Our last example is going to be of Hitler, who has Mercury combust the sun. So they are in different signs, but because they are 5 degrees away, it is still combust the sun. And so, as I mentioned, Mercury can over-identify when it's with the sun, the intelligence of the native. So this person, like Hitler, for example, his ego is predicated on if he is perceived as being intelligent. And so it's what's interesting is that one of the consequential things that happened that kind of led to Hitler eventually coming into power was the fact that he actually failed art school, and specifically the entrance exam to getting into art school. And so we can see here how this kind of triggers something within him. There is a need to prove oneself, to prove one's intelligence, or in a way superiority. And this is not going to be the case for everyone with Mercury combust the sun, but for this obviously specific example, he is going to take on the really negative forms of this alignment. So another area we can see is he's going to be maybe blind to other people's opinions. Mercury is our thoughts, and so he can almost have this kind of rigidity and unconsciousness around how his thoughts are very dominant, and not everyone agrees. And so there is an unconsciousness there where he maybe doesn't even recognize how he's being not adaptable. And it's specifically related to areas of spirituality and beliefs and the universality of all, because Mercury is the planet that rules the 9th house in his chart and the 12th house, which are actually both religious and spiritual houses, associated with our beliefs, associated with our love for everyone, our optimism in life. He has Mercury here, combust the sun, making him rigid and unconscious about these areas of his life. Interestingly enough, also the 9th house is the house of higher education. So his failure to get into the entrance, or his failure of the entrance exam to get into art school, can possibly be seen from this combustion here, where this area of his life isn't really well taken care of by Mercury. And so because of that, it's an area in which he is lacking or struggling with in some capacity. And so we can just see, I mean, there's so much to say about his chart that is indicating why he became so evil and did such atrocious things. But this is a very small indicator of kind of the mindset behind him, how someone can become dogmatic and not adaptive, and how they can become unconscious about how they're like this, and how they may be putting way too much emphasis also on how intelligent they seem to others. And so when he obviously failed the art exam, that was a big hit to that perception or that reality for himself, and led him down a path of having to prove himself. So this is how I'm going to end the video here. If you guys have any questions, please do let me know. If you're interested in learning astrology, check me out at willismoon.com. I have a course on there, and I believe I'll be running a very interesting workshop. I'm still deciding on which one I want to do. But if you're interested in joining a workshop with me, maybe around willpower and adolescence, check me out on my website and subscribe to my email list, and you'll get emailed about when that's coming up. All right. Have a good one. Bye, guys.